But what we try and encourage is think it through a little bit more and maybe realize that, well, it's not about having something to hide, but actually having lots to protect, because there are so many things about each of us that we're not ashamed of. It's not that we're hiding them, but that it's our decision when and where we are going to disclose those things. So health information, sexuality, for example, these are things that we have a right to decide whether we tell the world or not. And that's really, really important for our identity, our autonomy. So we do kind of really advocate about trying to help people understand practically why privacy matters.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Surfshark Wave Podcast. Today on the show, we have Ella Jakubowska, who is one of the policy advisors at European Digital Rights, or I'll call it EDRi for short for the remaining of the show. So hi, Ella, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, and thank you for having me.
That's awesome. You know, I thought this would be a perfect episode because Surfshark is actually one of the corporate donors of EDRi, and we're super happy to have you here. I guess my first question to start the show would be, what kind of rights do we have in the online space?
Yeah, digital rights is not a super well-known term, but actually when we say digital rights, we're just talking about all the human rights that, at least in Europe, we all benefit from, and particularly how they relate to things like using the internet, using technology. So digital rights actually build on very established human rights law that we have in Europe and internationally. And often in digital rights, we see that as things like the right to privacy, the right to data protection and not having information about us used unless it's necessary, but also rights like freedom of expression, so how we can share our ideas and build communities online and offline, as well as super important rights like equality and non-discrimination.
Okay, cool. And I guess the audience would also like to know a bit more about EDRi as an association. Could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so EDRi, we're a network. So we're made up of, in fact, over 50 organizations now working together across the world to protect digital rights for everyone, but also especially for people whose rights might be more at risk in the kind of online environment. One of the things that we hear a lot working in digital rights is what is illegal offline should be illegal online, but actually it already is. We hear that from lawmakers, from journalists sometimes, but it's actually much more about how we make sure those human rights that we already have and the things that are already illegal offline are properly implemented online, because technology does pose certain challenges. It moves very fast. We see more and more data being gathered about people than ever before. There's something called Kranzberg's laws, and Kranzberg was a researcher and academic who said technology is not good or bad, nor is it neutral. And for me, that's really at the heart of what EDRi does, because we're not saying, technology is incredible, but we're also not saying it's terrible. We're not trying to demonize technology, but we recognize that technology is embedded in society. It's always a deliberate choice whether to use or not to use technology and data. And so we want to interrogate what that means, interrogate how technology is constructed in our society to ultimately ensure that the digital environment is fair, that it's open, that governments and companies don't abuse their power, that we as people are not subjected to arbitrary surveillance, that we're not manipulated. So yeah, that's what we do as EDRi, and we work across a huge number of different topics to try and achieve this, everything from facial recognition through to regulating online markets, and also law enforcement use of data and everything in between.
That's very well put. Especially, I like that you said about technology is not all bad, because there are some organizations who like to say that, hey, technology is super bad. It's like collecting data and all this thing, but it's not all bad.
Yeah, there are bad uses of technology, and that's what we contest. That's what we work against, not, the intrinsic technology itself.
And when talking about achievements regarding EDRi, what would be your, I guess, most proudest achievement?
So there's a movement that I've been a part of since almost the very beginning of my time at EDRi called the Reclaim Your Face campaign. And it's a campaign that we launched with a number of other organizations to stop mass surveillance through facial recognition and other forms of what we call biometric surveillance. And we've got probably close to 100 organizations now, and we've been supported by almost 80,000 people across Europe to demand better laws to protect us from this kind of surveillance in public spaces. And we've been successful as a group in getting our topic on the political agenda, and we're now starting to see draft amendments to laws come out that actually would much better protect us from this kind of mass generalized surveillance when we're going to a protest, for example, or walking down the street. So I'm very proud to have been a part of that.
That's very interesting. What are the primary countries where this was happening mainly? Because I think I saw one of your talks, and I think that was something about Germany, I think, happening, correct?
Germany is definitely one of them, but actually we found this kind of facial recognition mass surveillance happening in pretty much every single European country. And that's why we felt like there was such an urgent need to mobilize across Europe and to really get this topic on the agenda, because everything from shopping streets, parks, universities, schools, every bit of our public and publicly accessible space, we were starting to see being policed by algorithm through these opaque cameras that either kind of track us across time and place and can say, look, Ella's going here and there and meeting this person in ways that can really be quite scary. And we really felt that needed an approach across Europe. So that was what the campaign was born out of. A great example, I think, is Clearview AI. There have now been a lot of data protection authorities in Europe responding to complaints that have been made by organizations like Privacy International, Homo Digitalis, Hermes Center, NOIB, and other groups, where now those regulators have come back and said, yeah, actually, Clearview AI, that notorious, creepy mass online database that's now been used by several European police forces for surveillance, is not legal and it's not right. And they've put a stop to it and issued massive fines as well. So we have also seen that by taking that broad European approach, it's helped us to be more successful in claiming those digital rights that are often not super well seen. If sometimes with other human rights, if you've been deprived of a certain right, but if you're being watched when you try and go about your day-to-day life, you don't always know exactly how you could be harmed. You don't know what database you might end up in and who that's being shared with. But even just the knowledge that you're being surveilled and watched can have what's known as a chilling effect on whether you feel comfortable to be yourself and express yourself in public. So yeah, it's been an honor to be a part of Reclaim Your Face for the last 2.5 years.
Now, you touched a point where, here in Europe, we do have a lot of laws to protect us, unlike in the US. So my question is, what are sort of the overall tendencies that you see in EU in terms of our digital rights?
We've actually seen in the last few years, I would say, an unprecedented amount of stuff happening on digital and digitalization, and a huge buzz. The whole digital world is being revised, and it's absolutely right that the EU has fantastic protections for people's privacy and personal data. The general data protection regulation, there's a huge amount that the EU does right in this space. But as you kind of gathered from me talking about Reclaim Your Face and our work there are some systemic inconsistencies. So one of the trends that we see is that whilst citizens tend to benefit from greater and greater protections of their data, non-citizens, especially migrants, people on the move, asylum seekers, people at borders, we increasingly see their data being abused and not given the same level of protection by EU authorities.
Another question I have is, out of all the initiatives that the EU is changing for our digital rights, what would be the one that EDRi supports the most?
I mean, this is a loaded question. I don't know if I would say that there's one that we support the most. Maybe I would flip the question a little bit, because our approach to regulation, to bringing in new EU level laws, is that the good regulation is knowing when regulation is needed and where it isn't. And in my experience as a policy officer, which means I often analyze proposals for new laws, is that you can have a law on a topic like artificial intelligence, and it could be a really, really fantastic law that could do amazing things for people in society if it's done well, or it could be a really, really bad law that we would want to get scrapped if it's prioritizing profit and surveillance over people and their rights. And often as a law is going through its kind of multi-year negotiation process, because EU laws do take quite a long time, which I think is necessary. The EU represents a lot of people, and it's right that all the different countries get to properly scrutinize those laws. But you can have a law that you think, well, this is going in a really fantastic direction, we're really supportive of it, and a few weeks later, something's brought in that's a red line and you no longer support it. So it's less a case of having one law that stands out and more that we get positives and negatives in really all of the laws on which we work.
And speaking of new regulations, the one that I want to touch upon was the Child Sexual Abuse Regulation, or as I'll call it next, CSAR for short. Now, this is an interesting regulation for a couple of reasons. And, it seems that it's not as clear-cut as it seems, because essentially what this regulation wants to do is it wants social media companies to scan and search for abuse on their platforms. Now, this all sounds well and good on the first glance, but the problem that I think we see here at Surfshark is that it sort of poses a threat where what happens to communication that is encrypted?
The proposal is based on this idea that we can use AI technologies, we can use other advanced, clever technologies, and that will solve this really, really serious problem. But actually, it's so much more complex than that. And there's also a really important point that something that's really missing is the idea that you can't do something at any cost. So fundamental rights, human rights that we have in the law of the EU are sometimes in tension with each other. It can sometimes be hard to know how to balance rights that might seem to be competing. So I have a legitimate right to privacy when I'm online, but of course a child has a legitimate right not to be abused. That doesn't mean that you could, for example, lock me away when I've done nothing wrong, just in case I might cause harm to a child. There's a necessary evaluation of whether a particular solution is the right fit for the problem and whether it's proportionate. And so actually what this new EU proposal is doing is kind of saying we can take measures no matter the cost, because what we're trying to achieve is so important. And that's not how democratic societies work. You don't put every person under suspicion just in case. And so you're exactly right. On the face of it, it might seem like, well, how could you oppose a law to protect children? The issue that we face is whether this proposal is the right thing to do. And our analysis indicates very clearly that this proposal is not the right thing for this problem. And that's because the way it's been drafted right now will pose enormous threats to the privacy, security, and freedom of expression of potentially everyone in the EU. And because the online space doesn't have borders, it will have ramifications across the world.
The reason why this law is so scary for us is because I think it sort of breaks encryption at that point, right? Your messages could be, I don't know if they would be encrypted at that point, right? If the social media site can read them when you send your friend over a text. But what we see actually quite a bit, sort of social media spaces and things like that, is that people tend to say that, oh, I have nothing to hide, so why does this matter to me? To me, as a big fan of cybersecurity and big supporter of it, is that this is a scary thought that people tend to say these things. So why is encryption of our everyday lives is so important?
To your point about nothing to hide, I did really, really want to touch on that, because we hear that so often in our work. If I had €1 for every time I heard that, I probably wouldn't need to be doing my job anymore. But what we try and encourage is a flipping of that to help people think it through a little bit more and maybe realize that, well, it's not about having something to hide, but actually having lots to protect, because there are so many things about each of us that we're not ashamed of. It's not that we're hiding them, but fact that it's our decision when and where we are going to disclose those things. So health information, sexuality, for example, these are things that we have a right to decide whether we tell the world or not. And that's really, really important for our identity, our autonomy. So we do kind of really advocate about trying to help people understand practically why privacy matters. But there's also this kind of more sinister underlying fact around democratic societies, around why we need democratic societies. If you think of, for example, in the Soviet bloc in the second half of the last century, when people were placed under super surveillance societies where their governments were watching them all the time, where people were turned against their neighbors, it was all on the premise of, well, if you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't worry. But actually what we saw is that it led to fear, oppression, control, and was a smokescreen for persecution of political dissidents, political opponents, human rights defenders, journalists, all these groups of people can be especially targeted when we no longer have our right to privacy. And then it becomes super, super hard to have a democratic society. Just think about voting, right? We all vote in secret. That's actually about the right to privacy. That's based on the idea that you can express yourself fully, you can participate in your democracy thanks to the protection that you get by being able to vote in private. So actually, there are just so many ways that privacy protects us that has nothing to do with trying to cover up illegal things. Really, it's an issue of justice, it's an issue of freedom. And that's why I try and tell people to try and think of privacy as a gateway to almost all of your other rights, because without privacy, every other human right that you're entitled to becomes a lot harder to access.
Yeah, I think people again, like you said, they don't understand the value of their data. And the thing about data is that once it spreads on the internet and it's on some database or somewhere, it can be difficult to remove it. So that's another danger of that. So overall, this law, when we sum up, it's definitely not, as they call it, technology neutral. But overall, what is your take on the future of our rights? Are we going towards the right direction?
I see in my work every day the number of people that care about human rights and digital rights and the growing awareness, and just how many people are committed to getting this proposal right. And so I do feel that we've got all the right people at the table. It's just that at the moment it can be quite hard to get out of the different camps and to look beyond. But I think actually if we could work collaboratively across digital rights and children's rights and bring our respective expertise, we actually could come up with a solution that is really going to protect children and do some really great things for the online space. And there are so many people across Europe, so many organizations and globally as well that are supporting this work, that I'm optimistic that we are going to be able to make sure that vital security technologies like encryption are not undermined in Europe, that we're not all subjected to generalized surveillance, and that we can use the internet and other digital technologies in a fair and open way.
Thank you. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel after all.
There has to be, otherwise, we talked earlier about some of the victories, and with EDRi reaching our 20th anniversary soon, we've been doing a big piece of work looking back at all the times when people have mobilized to demand that we have better laws and to make sure that these things are done right. And there have been so many of those victories. And so it is heartening to look back and know that there will always be challenges, but that gives us an opportunity to do it better. And we're listened to by a lot of policymakers. They take our expertise and advice seriously, which is such a privilege to have that opportunity to have a say in what our EU laws look like. So despite everything that I've said, I'm quite optimistic.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, awareness, that's what people
Absolutely.
need to awareness is very, very important. And speaking of awareness, thank you for coming on the show. I want to, maybe you could tell us where could people find your work?
Yeah, so our website is just EDRi.org, and we're on Twitter at EDRi. We've got so much there about all the different topics that we work on. And I'm also on Twitter at Ella Jakubowska1, although hopefully whoever's listening to this will have that written down somewhere, because I know it's not the easiest name to spell.
We'll put it in the description below, actually, so all the
Fantastic.
links will be there. So thank you for coming on, and it was a very interesting talk. I'll be definitely following the latest news about this law to see how it goes. And I'm actually optimistic. I think that we, again, like you said, we are going towards the right direction, and hopefully things will be looking up. And hopefully, hey, other countries, especially the US, can take an example of this. But hey, if you want to know more about your digital rights, and if you are interested in cybersecurity, then definitely watch more of our podcasts, and stay connected, stay safe with Surfshark.